Okay, thank you everybody for joining us. We're excited to have Mindy Weisberger talk about her new book, Rise of the Zombie Bugs. Mindy Weisberger, a science writer and media producer, is a senior science editor at Scholastic. Her work has appeared in numerous outlets, including CNN.com, Live Science, and Scientific American. Without further ado, let's get to her presentation.
Hello, thank you, Jeff. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you so much for having me. I am very pleased to be here. And before we get started, I just want to mention that this book and by extension, this talk are based on scientific observations and research that span continents and cultures and centuries. And the science of behavior manipulation involves contributions by men of color, by women of color, and white women, by indigenous communities. And biodiversity in nature creates stable, thriving ecosystems. And so, in much the same way, science is made better when it embraces voices that have been historically and systematically excluded from scientific conversations. And now, more than ever, it's important for everyone who cares about science to hold that close. First, a little bit of background. I'm a science writer, media producer. I've written about science as a journalist for CNN, Scientific American, Live Science. I've written about science for institutions such as Scholastic and the American Museum of Natural History. I've covered paleontology, new species discoveries, climate change, and space. And while I'm not a scientist myself, I am a giant science nerd. But before I was a science writer, I was a filmmaker and a giant film nerd. And I had a deep appreciation for low budget filmmaking and horror storytelling. And one of the subjects that ticks both of those boxes is zombies. With that, I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So, Night of the Living Dead wasn't the first movie to feature zombies, but it's essentially patient zero for zombie storytelling in 20th and 21st century film and television. It was released in 1968, and at the time, zombies were not super common in film, but the success of The Night of the Living Dead really changed that. And if you fast forward from there to the present, almost 60 years, you might have noticed that zombies are having a bit of a moment in pop culture right now. So some of you may be aware of Night of the Walking Dead, which was, of course, originally a comics series, recently finished a 12-year run, had multiple spin-offs and was immensely popular. A little more recently, we have The Last of Us, which was a very popular video game and an HBO series. Season 2 recently aired. But that is just the tip of the zombie iceberg. There are period pieces with zombies set in medieval Korea. There are classic literature adaptations that involve zombies. There are even zombie romantic comedies, or as they are known in the business, rom-coms. Even the Disney Channel has hopped on the zombie bandwagon with its musical film series for kids. And you can find zombies in video games. You can find them in tabletop RPGs. They're in comics, they're in movies, they're in TV, streaming series. Our pop culture landscape is literally crawling with zombies. And as it happens, so is the natural world. So considering that I started out as a film nerd with a taste for zombie movies, I was pleasantly surprised as a science writer to find that zombies, in fact, are real, are a lot more common than you might expect, have been around for millions of years, and have been studied for centuries. And there are still a lot of unknowns about how exactly they affect host behavior. But before we get into any details about that, there's a very important question that we need to address. And that is, what is a zombie? Now, film nerds can argue about that question for days. We're not going to go that deep into it. But in the context of the natural world, when scientists talk about zombies, they're referring to organisms that are being manipulated by a parasite for a purpose that benefits only the parasite and is usually an important part of the parasite's reproductive cycle. So depending on the zombifier and the host, there are different strategies that target different aspects of the host's neurochemistry. Does the zombie die as a result of the manipulation? Usually yes, but the core of zombification is manipulation of the host's behavior. And the second part of that is it's a behavior change that benefits only the parasite. So as with zombies in pop culture, there are sometimes physical changes in the host as well. So for example, this is a periodical cicada. They emerge in broods in cycles of 13 and 17 years. Brood 14 is now emerging in a dozen US states. You might notice that this cicada has what looks like a yellow plug coming out of its backside. That is a mass of fungal spores. So periodical cicadas are infected by the fungus Mesospora cicadina. And what that does is it infects them, it makes their butts fall off and replaces them with a spore plug. And it then manipulates the cicadas to spread zombification through mating, kind of along the lines of a zombie STD. Another zombie that is physically changed by zombification is caterpillars that are infected by baculoviruses. What these viruses do is they suspend the caterpillar's metamorphosis, make them climb trees or plants where they hang by their prolegs, and then when they die, they melt into goo, and they dissolve and dribble down to infect other caterpillars and spread infection. Here's another example of a very dramatic physical change done by a zombifier. This is a snail infected by tiny worms in the Leucochloridium genus. And what they do is they infect snails and produce these brood sacs that migrate into the snail's eye stalks and then pulse there. And as you can see, they very much resemble the undulation of crawling caterpillars. And what these worms also do by way of behavior manipulation, they make the snails wander out into the open where hungry birds are more likely to see the caterpillar-like eye stalks and eat them. Now, birds are the definitive hosts for these worms. So when the worms manipulate snail behavior, they get to where they need to be inside a bird in order to reproduce. Now, all of these are parasites that manipulate their host's behavior in ways that help the parasite. And there's one example of insect zombification that is arguably more famous than these examples we've just seen, and that is zombie ants. So what you are seeing here is an ant, sort of. Several weeks prior to when this photo was taken, the ant was infected and then overtaken by a zombifying fungus. The ant is now dead. While it might still look like an ant, by the time of its death, it was more of a fungus wearing an ant suit. So the ant's body was stuffed with fungus. Most of it is still inside the ant. The visible part that you're seeing right now, the stalk that's emerging from behind the ant's head, is what produces something called a stroma, which is the spore-producing structure. And that's how it reproduces. This particular fungus belongs to the genus Ophiocordyceps. This was the inspiration for the zombifying fungal pathogen in The Last of Us. They mostly live in the tropics, but their overall distribution is global. It includes around 320 species, of which 35 are known to not only infect their arthropod hosts, but also change their behavior. And there may be hundreds more zombifying species that are yet to be discovered. Now, most of the behavior manipulating species in Ophiocordyceps infect ants. And here's how that works. So an ant will be out on the foraging trail on the forest floor, minding its own business. It will pick up spores that are lying on the forest floor. The spores, responding to chemical cues in the ant's body, they penetrate the cuticle and they start to grow. They grow inside the ant's body and they surround the muscle tissue until the ant is about 40% fungus. That is just Act 1. Act 2 is where zombification really kicks in. So about 1 to 2 weeks after Ophiocordyceps infects its host, it makes the ant leave its nest, climb to an elevated spot on the underside of a leaf, and bite down. The fungus then erodes the muscle fibers in the ant's mandibles, so it can't unlock its jaws. It's, biting down tight, and it can't let go. The ant dies in that spot, and then the fungal stalk emerges from behind the ant head, grows that spore-producing lump called a stroma. This releases spores that are then picked up by other ants. So there's a physical and a neurochemical aspect to the ant manipulation. The fungus grows throughout the ant's body and wraps around its muscles, but it's also involved in the production of brain-altering proteins. So at the same time that it is physically manipulating the ant, it's also releasing these compounds that do things like affect the production of serotonin, which is linked to foraging behavior in ants. These compounds affect dopamine, which is linked to biting behaviors, and it also disrupts chemoreception, which is how ants communicate and follow their foraging trails. So these are all ways that the fungus takes control of the ant's behavior. But the final stage of zombification, where it makes the ants climb, that is particularly important. But how does it benefit the fungus? Well, climbing places the ant in an elevated spot. And here's where conditions are optimal for the growth of the fungal stalk. So this also allows the ant's corpse to remain undisturbed as the fungus emerges from its body. And then finally, being in an elevated spot also enables the fungal spores to spread as widely as possible. So what Ophiocordyceps does to ants is very, very specific. It can, in fact, infect many other arthropod hosts, but when it comes to behavior manipulation, the reigning hypothesis is one ant species, one Ophiocordyceps species. And one of the things that I found absolutely fascinating about this relationship between zombie ants and zombifying fungi is just how ancient it is. So Ophiocordyceps evolved about 100 million years ago. It's not clear when it started manipulating its host's behavior, but a fossil discovery in 2010 from the Messel pits in Germany suggests that at least 48 million years ago, ants were being manipulated in a way that greatly resembles the zombification of modern ants. So this is a fossil leaf, and there are 29 marks on this fossil leaf. I've indicated some of them with these arrows, and these marks are arranged along the veins of the leaf. Now, when scientists who study zombie ants saw this fossil, something about those marks looked very, very familiar. They looked like the bite marks that have been left on leaves along the veins by modern zombie ant victims of Ophiocordyceps. So the resemblance between these bite marks, the ancient ones and the modern ones, hints that 48 million years ago, relatives of modern Ophiocordyceps were zombifying relatives of modern ants. And they left behind traces of zombified behavior that are a very, very close match to bite marks that are left in leaves by ant zombies today. But why were there so many bite marks on that fossil leaf? Because, obviously once an ant bites down, it's not going anywhere after that. That is also something that scientists have observed while studying zombie ants in locations in South America. Because zombie infections are chronic in ant colonies. They typically don't wipe out the colonies, but they never quite go away. So this isn't like the stereotypical zombie outbreak that you're going to see in a movie. Scientists describe it as being more like a chronic cold that just keeps getting passed around. And scientists have found that there are locations near infected ant colonies that become graveyards for zombie ants. So there's something about certain spots that seems to attract zombies. Now, in 2009, researchers from Denmark and Thailand and the US mapped aggregations of ant cadavers in one of these graveyards in southern Thailand. What they did was they, in a rainforest plot that measured about 14,600 square feet, they turned over every single leaf in that plot, and they counted more than 2,000 dead ants, each anchored in place under a leaf by its clenched jaws and with a little telltale stalk behind its head. A monument to the effectiveness of Ophiocordyceps manipulation in the name of reproduction. So as you can see in the images here, so these The one up top shows you what the ant looks like on the underside of the leaf. The one on the bottom is flipped, but underneath the leaf is where the ants typically bite down. So, but what is so special about the locations of these specific ant graveyards? Well, in 2019, scientists conducted experiments, and they found that graveyard selection for Ophiocordyceps was linked to sunlight exposure, and that the fungus may be guiding its hosts to certain spots by affecting how they see light. So researchers from the Netherlands and Brazil tested that in rainforest locations where a species of Ophiocordyceps had established graveyards near colonies of its hosts, which were carpenter ants. And what they did was they set up shading screens over 10 sections of ant graveyards in the Brazilian Amazon in the Duck Forest Reserve. So for each graveyard, half of it was in shadow. And then they counted existing ants that were already in the graveyards, measured their positions, and then waited for more zombies to show up. So when newcomer zombie ants visited these graveyards, they were overwhelmingly drawn to the sunnier side. So the areas that the scientists had shaded ended up with fewer infected ants, and the ants that did climb the plants that were in the shade and died there produced fewer fruiting bodies for the fungus. So, and those ants also, interestingly, climbed higher than the zombie ants in the sunnier spots, perhaps because the fungus that was puppeteering them made them work just a little harder at the end to find a suitable level of light before they died. And the presence of light likely comes along with a certain temperature range and humidity, and this creates the conditions that the fungus needs for its reproduction. However, so there's a lot that scientists are learning about the zombie ant fungus, but this is just one type of parasite that changes its host behavior. This was the first one that I learned about when I was researching the book, but there are many, many more. And fungi like Ophiocordyceps are a great example of how you don't need a brain to take over someone else's brain, but there are some types of insects that have evolved to parasitize and zombify other insects. And what they do is so horrific that it made the naturalist Charles Darwin question the existence of a benevolent God. And Darwin was no stranger to strange animals, so it took a lot to get him shook. But he spent from 1831 to 1836 aboard the HMS Beagle as the ship's naturalist, visiting the South American coast, where he observed, documented, and collected many, many samples of unusual wildlife. These included fossils of bizarre extinct animals like the giant mammal Toxodon, which had a massive body, a face like a manatee's, teeth like a rodent's. And Darwin wrote in 1845 that Toxodon was perhaps one of the strangest animals ever discovered. So, as an evolutionary biologist, and the architect of the theory of evolution by way of natural selection, Darwin recognized and appreciated biodiversity. But even Darwin found it hard to stomach the reproductive practices of ichneumonids, which are a type of parasitic wasp that lay their eggs inside living caterpillars. The eggs hatch, and the wasp larvae grow inside the caterpillar, finally burrowing out and building their cocoons on the caterpillar's backs while the caterpillar is still alive. And this disturbed Darwin so much that in 1860 he wrote to his friend, the American botanist Asa Gray, and he said, "I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created the ichneumonidae with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars." Ironically, today, ichneumoniid wasps are also known as Darwin wasps. So the name was proposed in 2019 by an international team of entomologists, and what they wanted to raise awareness about the wasps, which, despite their reputation, have not been well studied since Darwin noticed them and was squicked out by them in the 19th century. And the entomologist wrote at the time, "We hope that the name catches on and that Darwin wasps start buzzing more loudly across all disciplines of biology." Whether Darwin would have been flattered or horrified by this gesture unfortunately, is something that we will never know. But here's a glimpse of one stage of what those wasps do to their caterpillar hosts. So this is a hornworm, which is a caterpillar of a sphinx moth in the genus Manduca. And on its back are cocoons. These are made by larvae of the parasitic wasp Cotesia congregata. And these wasps are very tiny, so just a few millimeters long. And in just a few seconds, when a female lands on a caterpillar, she can lay from a dozen to more than 100 eggs. Along with the eggs, she delivers an important part of the zombification process, a virus. So this is an interesting partnership. About 100 million years ago, ancestors of these wasps evolved a partnership with a type of virus called poly-DNA viruses, or PDVs. The viruses became encoded in the wasp's genome. And when the female wasp today injects her egg into the host, she also injects viral particles in the fluid surrounding her eggs. So inside the caterpillar, the eggs hatch, the larvae feed on its hemolymph, which is the blood of insects, and they grow through 2 instars, or growth cycles. And then they start to chew their way out. Then once they emerge, and remember the caterpillar is still alive, the larvae molt one last time, and then with their shed skin forms a plug in the hole through which they climbed out of the inside of the caterpillar. They then spin cocoons on the caterpillar's back. The caterpillar remains alive until the wasps hatch as adults and fly away. Now, here's why zombifying the caterpillar is important. The caterpillar needs to accommodate the growth and health of the larvae. So it needs to just let them be, provide nourishment, and not mess with them until they are ready to come out of their cocoons and fly away. So after the larvae chew their way out of the caterpillar's body, it doesn't try to destroy them. And it even protects cocoons against other would-be predators. So over the past few decades, scientists have learned that the PDVs, these viruses, actually play an essential part in the zombification of these caterpillars for parasitoid wasps. So along with other chemicals that the wasp produces to change caterpillar behavior, PDVs also modify the caterpillar's behavior in several ways. So the first thing they do is they disrupt the immune system. So this is important because after a wasp has injected her eggs into a caterpillar, the natural immune response would attack and destroy the egg. So what the virus does is it flips that off. It turns that switch within the caterpillar so that it doesn't destroy the wasp eggs and larvae. So what the PDVs do is they express genes that disable cells in invertebrates called hemocytes. And hemocytes typically destroy invasive organisms. And what this does is this keeps the caterpillar's immune system from getting rid of the eggs and allowing the hatchling larva to continue to grow and develop. The next thing that PDVs do to modify host behavior is they slam the brakes on the caterpillar's own growth and development. So obviously, caterpillars will eventually metamorphose and become moths or butterflies. Not when they're infected by these guys, because what PDVs do is they block production of hormones in the caterpillar that start its progression to the next instar and its eventual metamorphosis. So with these viruses, these PDVs circulating in its within its system, the caterpillar does not move on to metamorphosis. It is now simply a food source and a home for the wasp larva. Another way that the wasps and the PDVs change caterpillar behavior, caterpillars are widely known for their appetites. There was actually a fairly well-known children's book about this. And in lab experiments, scientists found that caterpillars that were not infected would happily eat wasp cocoons. But infected caterpillars that had these wasp cocoons on their backs, well, you would think this would be a fairly easy meal for them. They wouldn't eat them. And so why is that? Well, in 2016, researchers found that in zombie caterpillars, there were elevated levels of compounds suggesting that there had been some kind of a massive neurochemical response that suppressed their appetite and also suppressed their movement. And the scientists also identified proteins in the caterpillars that were produced by the wasps specifically to tinker with caterpillar neurochemistry. So not only did they find that there was this massive response, this chemical response that was happening within the caterpillars, they were able to connect it to activity from the chemicals that had been injected to them by the wasps. So, and this is why zombification and behavior manipulation is part of the package for the wasps when they lay their eggs in the caterpillars. Because parasitizing and just killing the host would not be a great outcome for them. Because even after the larvae have emerged from inside the caterpillar, spun their cocoons, the caterpillar still needs to stay alive. Because if the host caterpillar were to die at that point, that would attract predators and bacteria, which would not be great for the developing larvae. So the wasps not only lay their eggs in the caterpillars, with the help of domesticated viruses, they also override the caterpillar's immune systems, suspend their metamorphosis, and eventually make the caterpillars stop moving around and stop eating. And this zombifying strategy is it's this remarkable partnership between parasitic wasps and PDVs that is millions of years old and benefits them both. Now PDVs, the viruses, can't replicate in the caterpillars. So by helping the wasps to zombify caterpillars, the viruses keep the wasp larvae safe. And then the virus's success, it depends on the wasp larvae thriving inside the caterpillar and becoming mature adults, because once they do, then the viruses inside the wasps can replicate. So, and the wasps, from the wasp perspective, their reproductive strategy would completely collapse without the help of these domesticated viruses that are helping them to control the caterpillar's behavior. So it's a win-win for everyone involved, except of course for the caterpillars. Now, so far, we've seen examples of zombifiers who move their hosts through their normal environments, but in unusual directions. However, there's a zombifier whose manipulation involves sending its hosts into places where they usually never go. Now, these parasites infect insects and spiders that live on land, and then drive their zombie hosts to jump into water, where the hosts usually drown after the parasite wriggles out of the drowning zombie's body. This thread-like animal is a hairworm in the phylum Nematomorpha. And most species are semi-aquatic. They live in freshwater ecosystems, and they're very widespread. You can find them on every continent except Antarctica. They're free-living as adults in water, but as larvae, they're parasitic. And when hairworms hatch in water, and they go through a series of hosts. So when hairworms first hatch in water, the first hosts are aquatic arthropod larvae. They enter their host through the mouth or by burrowing through the tissue around the body. Then they form cysts inside these larvae, and they hang out there. They hang out inside these hosts until their hosts leave the water as adults. And if things work out for the hairworm, that host is eaten by an arthropod on land, possibly a cricket or a beetle or a praying mantis. And once that happens, then the hairworm comes out of its little protective cyst and it starts to grow. It grows a lot. It grows so much that by the time it's ready to emerge, about 3 months later, the hairworm is much longer than the body of its host. So now it needs to come out, but there's just one problem. These worms reproduce in water, but at this stage in their life cycle, they're stuck inside a terrestrial insect. So what do? They compel their host to seek out water and jump in. Now, once their host is in water, the parasites, they prefer natural water, understandably, but in a pinch, they will seek out livestock troughs, water bowls for pets. People have found them in toilets and in swimming pools. Once they are in water, the worm wriggles out and swims off and looks for a mate. This takes about 10 minutes on average. And after that, the host is left to fend for itself, if it's still alive at this point. So this behavior has been anecdotally described in scientific literature for more than 100 years, But it wasn't formally studied until the early 2000s, when a group of scientists who were studying these zombifying hairworms gathered at Avesnes in southern France. Now, people have visited Avesnes for centuries for spa treatments and to bathe in the local springs. But the scientists, even though they weren't there for a spa retreat, they were still interested in water. So over 2 summers in 2001 and 2002, the researchers conducted stakeouts at a pool in what would be the first scientific investigation of how hairworm parasites affect their host behavior, to see if they could establish a link between the insect's attraction to water and the manipulations of a zombifying hitchhiker. So first they observed the behavior of just terrestrial insects around the pool. And the most common insects were wood crickets. And nearly every cricket that they saw approach the pool eventually jumped into the water. And then once it dove in, a little thread began to peek out from the backside of the host. Sometimes it would spool itself out immediately. Sometimes it would unwind over several minutes. And eventually, once it was all the way out, it would swim away, often after the cricket had drowned. If the researchers removed a cricket from the water before the parasite had gotten all the way out, the zombified cricket would just go back to the pool and jump right back in. So this photo, which is taken from another lab in the US in the 2010s, will give you an idea of the fully stretched out, unspooled hairworm body length. And then here's an example of what it looks like relative to its host. But back to Avesnes. For the scientists' next experiments, they gathered crickets from the area around the pool and then gathered crickets from the forest. They kept them overnight and then released them near the pool and then noted which ones jumped in the water. And as soon as a cricket jumped in the water, that was it. The experiment was over. They were collected and put in the cricket jumped in water bucket. Then afterward, all the crickets were taken back to the lab. They were euthanized and dissected to see which ones had zombifying parasites inside. And of the crickets that approached the pool, 95% of them were infected with a hairworm. And for the final stage, they did lab experiments where the scientists again tested crickets that were collected from deeper into the forest and crickets that were collected closer to the pool. So the researchers put the crickets in a Y-shaped maze with troughs at each end. One of the troughs was dry and the other was full of water. So they wanted to see if part of the manipulation was changing the way that the insects responded to the presence of water. So they observed which branch of the maze the crickets entered, how they behaved when they reached the water, if they went into that side of the maze, and then they dissected the crickets to see which had hairworms. So both infected and uninfected crickets visited the branch with water, but the infected crickets jumped into the water. So, based on all of these experiments and all of these observations, the scientists concluded that the presence of the parasite seemed to be manipulating host behavior to not only lead it into water, but to get it to jump in. And this is an act that is something that if the host insect were in full control of what it was doing, it wouldn't do it. It just normally wouldn't do it. But if a cricket had a hairworm inside, the hairworm was the one that was making the decisions about what the insect host was going to do. But how were the hairworms making their hosts seek out water? Well, another team of scientists in Japan and Taiwan was working, they were doing similar research, also looking at hairworms and behavior manipulation, but they were working with giant Asian mantises, which are also parasitized by hairworms. And they were questioning if the attraction to water might have something to do with hairworms changing how their insect hosts perceive and respond to light polarization, specifically how light reflects off water. So what the scientists thought was maybe some neural tweaking by the hairworm host made this type of light, polarized light reflecting off water, uniquely attractive to parasitized mantids and compelled them to seek water and jump in. So they conducted a set of experiments in the lab with infected mantids, placing them in cylinders where the insects had two options: an exit with unpolarized light and an exit with polarized light. And they found that infected mantids were in fact attracted to the polarized light. Then they also tested mantids with two pools of water. And what they did was they tweaked the water reflection. So one of these pools reflected light that was brighter but weakly polarized, and the other reflected light that was dimmer but strongly polarized. And again, most of the infected mantids chose the option with the strongly polarized light. So in their paper, the scientists wrote, "To our knowledge, this is the first study demonstrating that a manipulative parasite can take advantage of its host's ability to perceive polarized light stimuli to alter host behavior." Now, how exactly hairworms do that is still an open question. But the strategy has risks for the zombifier too, because if a zombie insect jumps into a pond or a stream and thrashes around a lot, that's something that is likely to attract fish or frogs or other types of aquatic predators. Well, it turns out that even if the hairworm's host is eaten, the hairworm itself may be just fine. In 2006, curious scientists conducted lab experiments in which zombified crickets that carried hairworms were given the chance to jump into water, which they did. The scientists then introduced fish or frogs into that pool. When the crickets started expelling their worms, they were eaten. However, about a quarter to a third of the worms managed to escape from the predators that ate their cricket hosts. If they were swallowed by fish, they would often wriggle their way to freedom out through the fish's gills. If they were swallowed by a frog, then they just simply wriggled their way out of the frog's mouths. The crickets, however, were not so lucky. A total of 477 crickets were swallowed by predators during the course of these experiments, and the scientists reported that there were no survivors. By now, you've met a few examples of parasitic zombifiers. There are many, many more, and there are still many unresolved questions about how exactly this zombification works. But for most people who aren't scientists studying behavior manipulation, which I'm guessing is pretty much all of us in this event, when we think about zombies, the big question is really something a little different, and it's should I be worried? So most pop culture zombie stories tend not to dig too deeply into explaining how zombifying pathogens evolve to manipulate their human hosts seemingly out of nowhere. The Last of Us, which I'm a big fan, with its horrific fungus-studded infected, is just one of a handful of zombie stories with a zombifying agent that closely mirrors a real-world zombifier, and that's the zombie ant fungus Ophiocordyceps. So naturally, one of the top questions after the debut of season 1, and something that was being that was being asked again as season 2 came around. Could the zombie ant fungus zombify people? So many news outlets contacted mycologists, entomologists, people that study Ophiocordyceps to address this question. Could the zombie ant fungus zombify people? And the short answer is no. Thankfully. In general, parasitic fungi typically don't survive in our warm mammalian bodies. In fact, one hypothesis about the evolution of high body temperature in mammals is to protect us against fungal pathogens. However, some types of fungi do thrive in mammal hosts. And The Last of Us suggested that climate change, warming temperatures could lead to fungi like Ophiocordyceps evolving to be more resistant to hotter hosts. And that could make us vulnerable. Is that in the realm of possibility? Well, some types of evolution happen on comparatively short timescales, as we can see from the evolution of different strains of COVID-19, different strains of the flu virus. We see bacterial pathogens evolving antibiotic resistance in real time, sometimes within just a few years. But again, in this particular case, the short answer is no. And to understand why that's a very unlikely scenario, we need to look at what scientists have learned about Ophiocordyceps' own evolutionary story. This is the oldest direct evidence of fungi parasitizing an animal. It's 122 million years old, and it's a scale insect preserved in amber with fungi, you can see emerging from the insect, that is in the same order that includes Ophiocordyceps. And that's really compelling evidence for the fungus parasitizing insects, but what about manipulation? Well, in 2019, scientists traced the origin of behavior manipulation in Ophiocordyceps by genetically analyzing more than 600 species in the fungal order that includes Ophiocordyceps. So they created a family tree and identified a common ancestor to 129 Ophiocordyceps species, including those that manipulate ant behavior. And the common ancestor was a fungus that infected beetle larvae but didn't manipulate them. And based on their findings, the scientists proposed a hypothesis that Ophiocordyceps evolved behavior manipulation when it began infecting ants that lived alongside the beetles. At first, the fungus probably just infected the ants but didn't modify their behavior. But ants, unlike beetles, are social insects, and they have behaviors for dealing with sick and infected individuals to protect the colony. And that usually means killing infected ants and removing them from the nest. So there would have been selective pressure for the fungus to evolve a new strategy that involved subverting ants' normal behavior, resulting in zombification. Could that happen again in mammals? Again, the short answer is no, because at this point, Ophiocordyceps has become so highly specialized over millions of years of evolution, its reproductive reach at present doesn't even extend across all insects, let alone pose a threat to animals that are only very distantly related to arthropods on the tree of life. And while host hopping is actually fairly common among fungi in the order that includes Ophiocordyceps, making the jump from arthropods to warm-blooded animals that are much larger and have more complex cells and more complex nervous systems, that would be an extreme evolutionary leap indeed. But there are some pathogens that have evolved to manipulate mammalian behavior. You are probably familiar with the rabies virus, which attacks the central nervous system, leading to brain inflammation and altered behavior. Toxoplasma gondii, which is a protozoan parasite that causes the disease toxoplasmosis. Its definitive host is cats, but it can survive in many species of birds and mammals, and even humans. Now, it's known to change rodent behavior, making rodents less fearful of cats and therefore more likely to be caught and eaten. And there's a growing body of evidence that Toxoplasma gondii can change human behavior, even if the infected person shows no other symptoms and it actually does not have the disease toxoplasmosis. So this is a growing field of study, but there are there has been some research showing that it can affect dopamine production, which may trigger increases in confidence or alter behavior related to reward seeking. And there are still many questions about how exactly T. gondii affects humans, but some type of brain manipulation is likely part of the package. However, understanding zombification goes beyond the studies of organisms that manipulate behavior. There's a scientific conference called the Zombie Apocalypse Medicine Meeting, which brings together scientists from multiple disciplines to talk about zombification as a way of understanding and communicating science. In 2011, the CDC jumped on the zombie bandwagon with a preparedness guide to a zombie apocalypse. And an assistant surgeon general, who at the time led the CDC's Office of Public Health Preparedness and Response, wrote that the rise of zombies in pop culture has given credence to the idea that a zombie apocalypse could happen. The proliferation of this idea has led many people to wonder, how do I prepare for a zombie apocalypse? So what the CDC was doing, obviously, they weren't trying to warn people about a potential zombie apocalypse. This is a way of addressing the idea of disaster preparedness and preparing for real emergencies. And since then, there have been scientific papers investigating institutional medical responses to zombie outbreaks. There have been emergency response training, medical training exercises based around hypothetical zombie outbreaks. And in Finland, a team that investigating the spread of infectious disease created simulations that modeled the spread of a zombie plague as a test for models that track infectious disease such as COVID-19. This figure shows snapshots of an example simulation at 6 different time steps, highlighting the spread of the epidemic. Humans are represented by the color green, zombies in the color red. And while this is a hypothetical example, models like these are incredibly useful for scientists developing tools to track pandemics as they spread in real time. And what they found was that with a starting point of one zombie, just one zombie in Helsinki, officials would have about 7 hours between the appearance of patient 0 and having to quarantine the city or kill every zombie. Otherwise, the zombie infection would spread too quickly to be contained, and the entire country would be overrun. So as you can see, there's a lot to be learned from the zombies of the natural world about brains, behavior, manipulation, and even how to prepare for and navigate deadly pandemics. And while we probably aren't going to be overrun by zombies anytime soon, it certainly doesn't hurt to know as much as possible about zombification in all its forms, just in case. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that presentation. If you have any questions, you can just put them in the chat and I could read them. Margaret says, that was fascinating. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
So are there any theories as to why this behavior developed? It's just or is it just like a, I guess they're probably difficult to assess, but
Well, evolution is about opportunities arising and then mutations that emerging that allow different forms of life to take advantage of their circumstances. So parasites are extremely common. One of the scientists that I spoke to for the book said that that parasitologists like to joke among themselves that the first form of life was free living, and then the second form of life was probably a parasite, because it's a very successful lifestyle. And at some point, certain parasites, because of the type of host that they were infecting, it was more advantageous for the parasite to reproduce if they were able to tweak the host neurochemistry. And so over time, the organisms that were successfully able to do that were able to reproduce and pass that on to the next generations. And what's really interesting about that is obviously it seems like kind of a roundabout way to get to where you need to go to reproduce, but because it's so widespread, because it's something that this kind of zombification is something that we see in insects, we see in viruses, we see in so many different places. There are so many diverse mechanisms for doing it. There are diverse organisms that do it. There are diverse hosts that they do it to. So clearly, it's something that works.
Bill asked, has funding been stopped for this area?
As we know, there have been some serious disruptions to science funding over the last few months. I think we're still at a stage where it's hard to say what the long-term repercussions are going to be, but I think it is safe to say that no area of scientific research is not going to be affected by this.
So you mentioned The Last of Us. Are there any other forms of media that you've used, like the actual zombification? I mean, that's the only one that I'm aware of. Do you know any other ones?
Oh yeah, well, it's what I like about The Last of Us is that it's unusual to find fungi at the center of a zombification story. before The Last of Us, there are a few examples. In fact, there's this wonderful novel, The Girl with All the Gifts, which was also made into a movie, which was also about a fungus that was inspired by Ophiocordyceps, the zombie ant fungus, and had a similar kind of effect. But in general, this is the thing where most zombie movies tend not to go too deep into what's causing the zombie infection. Sometimes there's a vague reference to a virus, but that's usually about as far as it goes. And the other thing about most of these fictional zombie plagues is that the symptoms seem to show up almost instantaneously, which is not the way it works in the natural world. So I think there's some wonderful there's so many wonderful zombie movies and TV shows. I mentioned a few. I mentioned a few in the beginning. Kingdom, the one that is set in medieval era Korea, is absolutely fascinating. Even though they don't go into the science of what is causing the zombification, but it's a very interesting study of how social and political factions deal with each other and how they deal with each other in extreme situations like a pandemic. And that's something that I think the good zombie stories, when they do that well, they're using zombification as a proxy for telling much bigger stories about us. And in fact, going back to Night of the Living Dead, that has been recognized for a long time as an indictment of racism in America and a commentary on racism in America. But it's also a zombie movie, and in many ways, The Last of Us is continuing that tradition by using the zombie outbreak as a way to talk about these bigger issues, to talk about how do people deal with emergencies? What do we do when social structure breaks down? How do we support each other? How do we turn on each other? What brings out the best of us and what brings out the worst of us? And that's one of the things that I think is just perennially fascinating about zombies and zombification.
Yeah, I agree. The Romero movies and Dawn of the Dead use the zombies as a way to critique consumerism and
Hmm.
uh, you know uh, so I really enjoyed that. But so Helen, you probably touched on this a little bit in your response. What fictional depiction of zombies would you consider closest to the truth?
Closest to the truth. That's a good question. Um, I have to say, The Last of Us, I think, does such a wonderful job in terms of the prosthetics, in terms of the way that the art direction and the costuming and the design team really they really studied how fungi of many different types, because of course the kingdom fungi is huge. All of these different ways that fungi produce fruiting bodies, how they spread, the way that vast networks of fungi communicate with each other through unseen mycelia. That was something that was referenced. The second season showed airborne airborne spread of the spores, which I think was actually, I'm not as familiar with the game, but I do believe that in the game the spores were airborne, but they made the decision in season one at least to back away from that a little bit so that people didn't have to be wearing masks all the time. But there are a lot of really, really great details in The Last of Us that I think do authentically mimic not just the way that fungi can manipulate behavior, but also just the way fungi look and the way that fungi behave. The only thing I would say is that about that is very, very far off the mark is the speed of infection, where we see that once someone is bitten by someone who's infected, within an hour, they have turned. And of course, in the real world, it takes weeks before an infected ant actually starts to show any signs of behavioral change.
So, anybody has any last question? Could put it in the chat. Nick said, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Sarah gave thumbs up. Sorry, background noise. But Margaret said, thank you. Okay, so if there's no more questions, thank you very much to Mindy Weisberger. Please check your email. Okay. We have a copy of the book to give away. And thank you again to Mindy. Please check out the book. We have some copies in the library. And I could send out a link to the book as well. Thanks again. And
All right.
have a good night, everyone.
All right. Thank you so much for having me.